Okay, well, I think one of the kind of key issues is that we don't know whether these trends will persist. We have really no idea. I think this is largely due to the fact that this virus that has hit us so severely is unknown in many respects. We don't know how long it takes for people to be infected and not show it, to be asymptomatic at that stage. We don't know how many people are asymptomatic in general. The World Health Organization has suggested it might be up to 40% of the world population. We have no idea. Other estimates suggest 3%. And then this whole question too of social distancing, which I suppose my talk was really all about in one way. How do we adapt our tools to actually deal with this whole question of social distancing, to look at the impact of it? This whole question of social distancing is very problematic. It's not at all clear how the virus is transmitted and the distances involved in this. I've seen work that suggests that the virus may be transported up to 6 meters away when people cough, particularly if the ventilation in the building is of a certain kind that mixes it in a certain way. So there really is great idiosyncrasy to all of these sorts of questions and whether we can pose answers. We don't really know whether we'll find a vaccine. We hope we will, of course. We are finding various antibodies and so on, which are helping to minimize the disease, and I think this will continue. So we have no idea how long this will last. The key issue, let me just look back at the question for a moment. The key issue in terms of decline in international travel, less dining out and so on, more working from home, this is also part of it. These key issues, to some extent, will make an impact, I think, within the next year. And of course, a year is a long time in some senses, and we may well begin to adapt in ways that will actually be permanent in some senses. I think, for example, I hope, for example, people will walk more in this particular context. On the other hand, I hope that people will not necessarily take to their cars more, in a sense. We have this sort of double whammy, really, of a situation where people may walk more, which is a good thing, but also people may get into their cars and live a long way away from big cities and so on, which to some extent is a reinforcement of the undesirability of urban sprawl in that sense. So these are really quite big questions that we have very few answers to. And the question, I suppose, is how far do we adapt our models to these sorts of issues in some sense? How far can we adapt them? That's what I've been talking about. How far should we? So they're very much open questions, I think. Well, I think that the modeling efforts that I mentioned basically indicate, and I could only do this very sort of in a very simple way, but they do indicate that there are many different modeling efforts that are relevant to thinking about the future of cities on many, many dimensions. And I think the most important thing is that we should use more than one model in this sense. I know I quoted George Box, basically, who said that all models are wrong, but some are useful in that sense. Indeed, many of our models, I think, are useful, but they have to be moderated in some fashion, and they have to be absorbed into a wider process of thinking about the future, thinking about what the ideal or more ideal future, more sustainable futures of cities should be. So our models in this sense should really be looked at in terms of a much wider context, part really of decision support. There is no model that will actually predict the future in any sense. We know that by now. The future is impossible to predict in that sense. The very pandemic that we've been talking about is evidence enough of this in some senses. So we're very unlikely to be able to predict. Now, this is very hard to accept, because if we are unable to predict, then why should we use models in this particular context? We may be unable to predict, but we're not unable to invent the future in that sense. It's our prerogative in this context, and therefore we need to explore the future. So I'd like to pose the general question that our models are useful in terms of exploring the future and indeed informing us about what possibilities are in a kind of what-if sense. what if, for example, a certain set of circumstances happen? What would be the impact in terms of what our models show us in this context? And that's the basis for a dialogue. It's the basis for a discussion. And it invokes, of course, quantitative and qualitative. It invokes academia and practice in the best sense. It invokes an informed public. It really invokes all of the issues that really pertain to thinking about how we can actually produce more sustainable, more efficient and more equitable cities in this context. Clearly, this is very important. How culturally bound are our models in some sense? And I think we can point to some very simple indications in this. For example, in the United States and to a lesser extent in Western Europe, we do indeed have the decline of the central city still. Some cities have reinvigorated themselves over the last 20 or 30 years, but in general, people move to the edge of cities, they require more space. There are other parts of the world where this is not the case. I believe in Indian cities, for example, there is more notion about living centrally. Certainly in Asia Pacific, there are some very big differences in terms of where people want to live and what resources they're able to command in different locations of the city. So in other words, our cities are very different in this context, and therefore our models should reflect this in a sense. I think there are also issues pertaining to the planning system with respect to cities, that different sorts of cultures have different types of planning systems with different mandates in this context. And what is, for example, useful in, say, the United Kingdom is not necessarily useful in Singapore. I think your planning system in Singapore, for example, mirrors to a very limited extent our own system in this sense, but the differences are very substantial. You have a city-state, basically, which is bounded in a very tight kind of way, but is, of course, open to the world in some sense. We, I suppose, in a European context, have a much bigger kind of city-state, the United Kingdom, etc., which indeed is physically bounded in the same way. But of course, there are substantial differences in this sense, substantial differences in terms of physical trade, even in this context. So I think all of these have to be really reflected in our models in that sense. I'm not going to go into chapter and verse about how we would do these sorts of things, but I do think that it's very important to take that into account. I should say that some of the things that we would want to test in, say, a developed countries context may be very different from the things that we want to test with our models in a developing countries context in that particular way. And our models should be suitably adapted. Of course, having said all of that, the information we have about cities in different parts of the world is also very different, and accessibility and availability of information is different, and therefore our models would probably be different because of this as well. Okay. Now, I talked about this whole question of scale. In other words, that we build models at different scales, and the models can indeed be very different at different scales in that sense. We may, for example, have a rather different approach if we're looking at the metro area from looking at a neighborhood or a district in some sense. The same things might be important, such as traffic, density, segregation, polarization, a whole range of things of this kind. But at the aggregate metropolitan scale, say, it would be very different from the local scale. What I was saying, in fact, in the presentation is that in thinking about the spatial pandemic, because everything is focused at the very local scale, the infection passes through contact between people, through droplets and so on in that context, and we are really talking about very small scale here. We're talking about a question of meters in this particular context, and this whole question of being able to organize ourselves in space so we can minimize the infection is in terms of how far we should social distance. And of course, wherever we travel, at whatever scale, we need to take account of this very local small-scale activity. So therefore, if we're building a retail model, for example, which is going to predict the number of shopping trips in a different place across a metro area. So for example, again, take Singapore. If you're thinking about how people shop in this context and using different modes of travel and so on in this context, it's very important to know how many people you can pack onto subway trains or buses and so on. Very important to know what the balance is in that sense between different modal transport systems in terms of moving to shop in this context. And that in and of itself has a major impact in terms of the infection. So at the macro scale, we might be predicting numbers of people arriving at shopping centres. When they get to shopping centres, of course, they have to shop in this particular context. And when they shop, of course, they have to social distance. So to some extent, even the arrival of people at shopping centres is relevant in terms of this local kind of social distancing. In other words, if we have too many people arriving at shopping centres, they simply cannot fulfill the activity of shopping in that context. And that goes the same for hospitals, schools, the journey to work, offices, everywhere where we're traveling to and from. Then when we get to the to, as it were, when we get to the destination, we need to take account of the capacities, etc., and the need for social distancing. So in that sense, our models at different scales become connected in some ways. We need to connect because there are things happening at the most local scale which impact at the aggregate scale. And of course, if we're thinking about international travel, global travel in this context, then it's important in terms of how many people we can get into an airliner in this context, how many people we can get into a high-speed train, which might be moving between countries, for example, such as those we have in Europe, Japan and places of that sort, and of course in China, how many people we can pack into those trains, and the kind of journeys they can then take, the number of journeys which can be taken may well be a lot smaller than what currently we experience, simply because of this notion about meeting capacity limits and social distancing. I think I actually said in the talk that in the UK, mainline trains, Network Rail, the trains that travel 200 or 300 miles between cities and so on, really need to be capacitated to about 15% of their capacity. In other words, we can only let 15% of the of the travelers, as it were, assuming the train is packed, 15% of these packed total values, basically, of passengers onto the train so that they can actually social distance. So, and of course, we're talking here about a social distance measure of 2 meters. That's what's been adopted in the UK. The 2 meter rule is actually questionable to some extent. If we were to relax it to 1 meter, then there would be a fairly big increase in the number of people being able to travel. That's the current debate, in fact, in the UK, in terms of what the appropriate guidance is. Of course, the nearer you are to somebody who is infected, the more likely you are to actually contract the disease. Okay, now this indeed is a very hairy estimate. If you're looking at my picture at this point, then the picture, you may be sort of intrigued to know where it is. It's the Bank of England on my, well, I'm just trying to think, you know, on Zoom, these things are the wrong way around, basically, when you're looking at it in this sense. I have my back to the Bank of England. I have my back to the Royal Exchange building. You're looking east, basically, at that point. On your right, you're probably seeing the Bank of England, and on the left, the Royal Exchange building. But behind that, you're seeing this cluster of skyscrapers. The biggest skyscraper, almost in the center of the screen, is 22 Bishopsgate. And that's a skyscraper of about 60 to 70 stories, basically. It's just being finished. It's the highest building in the City of London. All these skyscrapers have been built within the last 10 years. And of course, this is a massive amount of space. Of course, London, like Singapore and like Frankfurt and Tokyo and Manhattan and so on, has seen a massive boost in office personnel in the last 10 years or so, since the Great Recession, basically, and all of this capital has been ploughed into world cities. We've seen a massive building boom at this particular point. The question is, if a significant number of people work from home, and a significant number of people no longer come into the traditional office space in this context, what really will it do to the demand for space in this sense? My own feeling is that this is one of the great unpredictabilities. It's almost impossible to say. We don't know how many people will continue to work from home. The fact that I'm giving this, this webinar basically through Zoom basically gives you an indication there's been very rapid advances in our ability to actually work online in this particular context. I would never have imagined prior to this pandemic there were so many different systems now which are able to engage us in online interaction. So in that context, the world is extremely unpredictable. How many of the buildings behind me, how many people in 22 Bishopsgate, the tall tower basically, which is not quite opened, it was just finished off before the pandemic struck. How many people will go into that tower, basically, and all the other towers and buildings around? Very, very unpredictable, almost impossible to guess until we begin to emerge from the lockdown and begin to conquer in various ways this particular pandemic. Well, to some extent, every stage in building a model involves kind of a qualitative thinking. It involves our intuition. So many of our models, of course, are based on assumptions, and the assumptions in and of themselves are qualitatively organized, qualitatively motivated. We make assumptions about the effect of distance, and of course we then try and validate our models, and we find that the effect of distance may be somewhat different from the way we've articulated it in theory in that context. So in other words, there are a whole range of qualitative issues in terms of defining the models in the first place, and it's very important to bear that in mind. No one model is best in that sense. It's back to the George Box quote from 20 or 30 years ago, when he said that all models are wrong, but some are useful in this particular context. Many of these issues about the wrongness of models really relate to qualitative appreciation of the model. Of course, having said that about models, when we embed them into a wider context, then this particular context is important because it's dominated by qualitative thinking. If you think of us using these models to inform planners, policymakers, decision makers of many kinds, and even in fact to inform aspects of the general public, the informed public in some particular context, in the context, say, of participation in some senses, all of these issues really demand us to think qualitatively about the particular cultures and responses and procedures and so on. Different groups of people may be more comfortable, more appropriately geared to certain sorts of models than others in that context. So in other words, there are many cultural mores really, which really determine how we use models and what models we use in that particular context.